Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. It's a little bit different from our regular format. It should be a ton of fun working through the various governance questions you've provided us over the last 10 days or so. My name's Sean McDonald, and I'll be your moderator for the next 45, helping out Simon Telfer as well. Firstly, thanks for being here today. We appreciate the effort you've made to be here for our live event. And during the session, if you've got any questions, which we certainly hope you do, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as against the chat, because we can't keep a track of them if they're in chat. Finally, if you stay with us through till the end, which we hope you do, and is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering our 1-minute survey at the end of the webinar, you'll go into the draw to win our beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, for those who don't know much about BoardPro, we're a board software provider, and we serve around about 20,000 users around the world. And we enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more efficiently and effectively with clever software, less time, and deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we're a software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. So I'm going to race through the introductions here because we've got a ton of questions to get through. Starting off with Simon. Leaning on 20 years of international governance experience and board appointment experience, Simon Telfer offers practical real-world governance advice. He served on multiple privately owned business boards across sectors including construction, hospitality, software, digital, and pharma. Simon is founder of 18,000 plus member Appoint Better Boards community and has over 180 board appointments to his name via Stimulus Consulting. Kia ora to you, Simon.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Sean.
Stephen Bowman is Managing Director of Conscious Governance and brings a huge depth of experience with board reviews and strategic planning. Steve has a wealth of executive and governance experience and has written over 14 books on governance and strategy. Kia ora to you, Stephen. Lisa Cook is the founder and Managing Director of Get On Board Australia, supporting aspiring new and existing board members and boards to thrive. She has 13 odd years of experience serving on boards from a range of organisations in the private, public and not-for-profit sectors in Adelaide, Sydney and across the whole of Australia, including Shooting Australia, Inclusive Sports SA, West Beach Community Bendigo Bank and the Australian College of Professionals. Kia ora to you, Lisa.
Kia ora and g'day.
And g'day. Dauniika Puklowski is an experienced award-winning company secretary with experience in legal, health and financial services. Dauniika is a chartered member of the Institute of Directors and sits on the board of Takapuna School and is the founder and director of Board Administration Services. Kia ora to you, Dauniika.
Kia ora koutou.
Okay, so let's get into it. Today's session it's designed in a simple format. We've gathered together all of your questions from the last 10 days and curated them with our team of experts. We'll also be taking questions live from the floor. So to facilitate this, we'll pause 3 times or so during our webinar and take your questions live. If you do have a question to ask, please use the raise hand function on Zoom or type in your question to the Q&A box and we'll do our best to get through as many of these as we can. Simon, over to you.
Let's crack on. The first question was from Adam, who is the board chair. Given the increased level of liability, do you think that it's becoming more critical that board members become subject matter experts in their industry, in the industry that the board is serving? Steve, thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a couple of key things in there. One of them is that subject matter experts is probably a bit too broad a definition, but certainly need to get to know the business very quickly. So an extended induction program for new directors, for example, over a 12-month period. Specialists coming in and talking about the strategic issues facing certain elements of the business. So directors really should bring themselves up to speed as quickly as they can, but the board's role in that is critical to actually make sure that the directors are given the ability and the time to be able to actually bring themselves up to speed. Simon?
Nice. Steve, and I think too that we've seen some boards that have failed, sometimes because they've had no expertise, no domain knowledge or expertise around the table. And some have failed because, say, like construction, that if everyone around the board table has 30 or 40 years in the construction sector, they just think like everybody else. So I think there's certainly a balance there. I don't think you need to be subject matter expert, but if you don't have knowledge, you've got to have curiosity and probably an affinity with that sector. And the other thing is that how can you, having people around the board table that can take learnings from another sector, learnings from another board they're on and apply them to that board. So I think, yeah, less about full subject matter expertise, but that balance, as Steve alluded to it. Next question is from Kathy, and thank you, Kathy, for yours. It's an interesting one. Is there an expected percentage or number of board meetings board members should attend per year? Dauniika, what's your thought?
All of them, if you can, is the expectation. If meetings are generally set out well in advance, you'll get the board calendar of when meetings are going to be for the next year, ideally in August or September the year before. And so you should have the opportunity at that point to talk about any conflicts that you have in your calendar. So the expectation should really be that you go to all of them. And then the formal answer is going to be down to the constitution of your board. Generally, what I see is that it's probably about 75% of meetings that need to be attended. And if you miss any more than that, you'll be looking at probably needing to resign from the board or being asked to step away. But I think it's just about clear communication. If you genuinely have a conflict or you're sick, then as long as you're communicating with the rest of the board and the chair, then it's acceptable to miss a meeting, but try to get to all of them.
Steve?
Yeah, I think it's totally unacceptable to not participate in every single meeting. And by participation doesn't mean you actually have to be physically at the meeting or even electronically. But the key thing in that is that a director is a director and it's a full-time job. You cannot be a director. So you can't go on holidays. Sure, you might be in Thailand, but you also need to have read the board papers and make commentary on that, even if there is no questions that you've got. So to me, what's unacceptable is a board member not participating prior to the board meeting and letting the chair and or the CEO know any questions they may have. And then if they do that 3 times, then you can actually ask them to step off the board. Sorry, if they do not do that 3 times over the year, then they meet that criteria for the board not accepting the apologies of the director. My view, never accept the apology of a director unless they've contacted the CEO or the chair prior with any questions, or even if their commentary is, I have no questions. Simon.
Thank you, Steve. Lisa, I'm going to come on to you for the next question, if that's okay. And this is from Rule Gardner, and thank you for sending that through, Rule. What is the biggest governance mistake boards repeatedly making? You're limited to 3, Lisa.
I have one, and I feel because they don't do this, everything else ends up a problem. And it's really deciding on what the role of the board is, what their governance role is in a particular organisation at a particular point in time, and then knowing that, deciding on how they're going to get their work done. And if you don't have that as your foundation, then all of the issues that we see just have an opportunity to breed and become an issue.
Lovely point. Steve, you got something to follow on from that?
Yeah, the 3 biggest mistakes are having reports to the board that don't tell the board what they should be focusing on. The second biggest mistake is having reports to the board that don't help the board focus what they should be focusing on. One of the biggest issues that boards find is that they say they want to be strategic, yet the information they're being provided is a lot of content rather than the analysis and answering the so what question. Big mistake, and it happens in multi-trillion-dollar boards as well as very small boards. It's an understanding by the staff that their audience are directors, and they need to help the directors become focused by the way they present their reports.
Steve, I'm going to stick with you for Sabine's question, which is how common is it to have board-only time where part of the board meeting excludes management?
There's three types of these board-only times. The first is where it's only called when there's a problem and the CEO breaks out into a cold sweat when they know that it's being called. That's not a good look. The second type is where they never have it because they've never thought about having it. And the third type is where it's an actual regular part of the board meeting held at the start of the meeting. More boards are starting to hold it at the start of the meeting. So let me go back. More boards are starting to hold it at the end of the board meeting so that people don't have to wait for that to finish. Some boards are found holding it at the start of the meeting because then they can talk about some of the things they need to talk about. But having clear criteria about what is talked about at the board only session, and that is it should be about issues where it's not relevant for the staff to be part of that conversation, performance reviews of the CEO or the senior executives, depending on how far down the board goes with that. And lastly, issues of board performance in its own right, particularly board director behaviour. It should never be used as a precursor to the board meeting.
Dauniika, have you got something to add to that? We'll just go back to that question.
Yeah, no, Steve's probably really touched on it. It is an answer to the question, how common is it? It's very common. So I've seen it in most boards that I work for. They generally hold it at the start of the meeting, though I think Steve's touched on a good point. That's probably better to be at the end of the meeting. And I've seen some boards will minute those conversations in separate director-only time minutes, and other boards don't. So it's really just a space for the directors to be able to have free and frank conversations without management presence, that they can get to speak very freely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one key thing that I'll add in at Liberty as the moderator here is always follow up. If you're the chair and you have a board only time, always follow up with the CEO the following week or a few days later and say, hey, these were the things that were covered, just so that the CEO doesn't start getting really anxious about what's being talked, particularly if board only time went a bit longer than it normally. They're sitting there guessing. So I think that exchange of conversation, just these were the themes we covered, helps keep the management mind at rest. Lisa, I've got a little bit of a longer question here that has been put in by Dave, and thank you, Dave. You're one of the first questions that came through. He'd love some tips on managing the situation where a minority of directors disagree with a company strategy. Keen to hear that, as wouldn't be surprising, in a tightly held unlisted public company where those directors are also shareholders, albeit very small shareholders. So a little bit of complexity there. Lisa, what's your thoughts on managing that strategic misalignment conversation?
Yeah, one of the first things that come to mind is I question whether they have an issue more about how the strategy was come to rather than what the strategy is. And so that's something to reflect on. If these board members or directors don't feel like they were truly a part of the strategy formulation and the strategy decision, that could be what's bothering them more than what exactly was decided on. So you need to think about the whole process around that and whether that was done in a way that made everyone feel like they contributed to it. The other thing to be okay with is that not everyone's going to agree on everything all the time. And that's okay. If this is one of those decisions where majority rules, then part of being a director is understanding that there will be moments when the majority that rule in a certain direction isn't the direction that you would want to go in. And really that's a matter then for self-reflection, whether you can stay and get behind what everyone else thinks is a good idea without you holding a grudge about it and undermining the whole strategic achievement going forward. So what that leads me to want to encourage is the chair of this board to sit with and have a conversation with these directors that aren't in agreement and to explain all of that, to discuss it. That's okay that they don't disagree, but here's what I expect from you going forward. And it is showing a united front beyond the boardroom and to not behave in a way that's going to undermine the work of the board and the work of the team achieving the strategy and the organisation going forward.
Nicely put, Lisa. And look, and when I reflected on this question, the key word that came up to me was independent. And I'm wondering whether an independently facilitated strategy session, to your point, whether it's more about the process and the result, whether that could happen. And also about the makeup of the board, whether there's enough independence on the board. Because if those directors are minority shareholders, but they're turning up to board meetings with their shareholder hat on, thinking, how do I advance or protect my shareholding? That doesn't make for a great dynamic around the board table. So maybe there's a look at rebalancing who makes up the board, getting a little bit more independence on there, making sure that directors understand that when they're at the table, they've got a director hat on.
Absolutely.
Lisa, I'm going to keep with you after we've gone to a questions live session. And I see one hand up there. Sean, would you like to make that happen? And then we'll come back to the next question for Lisa.
Sure. So this question is from Tony Banks. Would you like to ask that question, Tony?
Tony's muted at the moment, so we'll get Tony to come off mute. It's never happened before on Zoom. Here we go.
Can you hear me now?
Go, Tony. Go for it.
So I'm the secretary for our board, and my understanding is that when they go to in committee or directors only, there should be some sort of resolution coming out of that to record in the minutes. Am I correct?
Who'd like to take that?
Me.
Great, Stephen.
So the only time that you need to have a minute in there is if there's a decision made on something. If the board is making a decision on something and they've come to that decision through the in-camera, it must be minuted in the board minutes. Now, I think one of the other panelists said that sometimes you get board-only minutes going, which some boards do as well. But again, the notion there is that it needs to be, if there's a decision that's made, it needs to be minuted somewhere.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, Tony. Great question.
Thank you.
Can we come on to, thanks, Tony. We'll get Noel. Is that right, Sean, or you're just going to stick with that?
We're with Adam at the moment.
Good on you. Good on you. Adam, thanks for your question. And Lisa, I'm going to ask you to take the lead on this. Question is, how can boards encourage wider, diverse thinking? There seems to be a trend to go for safe directors rather than going for younger, dynamic, different thinking directors.
Absolutely. Probably a concern on many boards. And of course, there's a time and a place for when you want safe directors, when you need that older, wiser, experienced person on the board. And there's a time when you have an opportunity to bring in something different. So something not that inexperienced board members, new board members, younger board members, whatever it is that you're looking for, think about that. So see this as a holistic picture. How is your team makeup right now, and what does the organization need? Because it might not be a good idea to bring in a fresh, new, inexperienced board member if the organization's going through something that they're not going to be able to help or add much value to. But if you are in the place where you can really I wrote an article this past week about the fact that we're all ignorant, and it just is. There's parts of us that are ignorant to whatever it is, and you've got to get comfortable with that, because as soon as you accept it and learn that you have that, you can then work with it and realize when that ignorance may be tapping you on the shoulder and stopping you from being willing to try something different. So listen to yourself. What are the excuses that you're telling yourself as to why you don't want to sort of digress from the usual people that you bring into boardrooms, and know that your own ignorance is working against you probably all the time.
Nicely put, Lisa. Steve.
Yeah, look, I think I could sit and listen to Lisa all day on this topic. I think she covered. To me, diversity of thinking is much more important than diversity of representation. And the key word in all of this is curiosity. You'll also get some black hats that sit around your board table. They're not particularly curious, or they are in a very different way. And that really is what makes the board conversation so much more powerful. We need to be able to look at things from all sorts of different points of view. Now, the question is, what are the different points of view that we need to be able to see things from? And the guidance for that is go back to your vision statement, go back to your strategy. What are the different points of view that, with some expertise and wisdom behind them, will help us make even greater choices that will create the future? Simon?
Steve, I'm going to stick with you for Anita's question, which was a shorter question, but one that could have a lot of depth to it. What are the strategies around to focus the board on the right things and not to get bogged down in that detail, that governance, operational divide, the helicopter view versus noses in, fingers out, that side of things?
What
strategies you got for us, Steve?
It's one of our favourite topics for all of us here. So the first thing is, what can a director do individually? The first thing they can do is make sure that they're reading the board papers always with the so what question in front of them. What do I need to focus on? And if they can't find the so what, then let the chair know that I can't find the so what in this paper, and then the chair can get the staff, if necessary, to rewrite it so it actually provides the insight that the director needs to be able to actually look at what are the conversations we need to have around the board table. The second thing that a director can do is ask of other directors, if they start to go too much down into the weeds, ask the director, what's the strategic issue behind you wanting this information? What's the strategic issue behind dot, and fill that in? One of the most powerful questions, because it invites the person to go up to a different level of conversation. Another thing that can be done very simply is to make sure that the strategic items that are necessary for either decision or discussion are put at the front of the agenda, the board agenda. And those items for noting, or the items for information, are actually really for noting and for information. Oh, but I'd just like to talk about, no. Okay, next question.
And next to you, Lisa.
Look, it comes back to my earlier response. You've really got to decide on what the right things are. And this is where I came back to decide what is the purpose of the board, what is their role, and how are they getting the work done? Because if you're getting bogged in detail, the answer to the so what question is going to be everything. So what everything? Because we haven't decided exactly what our role is. And whilst you say it should be strategic, on the one hand, a lot of people don't understand what that means. And on the other hand, there are certain times where the board does have to come down a level, and it doesn't make sense for them to just stay too high level and across a broad array of things. So talk about with the board, what are the right things?
Nice. Loving the energy here, loving the questions that have been submitted to us. And the next one is coming from Suzanne, and I'll get Lisa and Steve to answer this again. This isn't the Lisa and Steve show. It's just the way that the dice have fallen. And Dauniika, I haven't forgotten about you, and we will come on to you very shortly. But this question from Suzanne, who's on a board at the moment: when proposing a potential new direction in a board meeting discussion, and I love this, some self-reflection, I find my delivery to be direct, always conscious of time. I'm aware this can put people off. What is an effective way to ask questions and present an alternative way of thinking? Well done, Susan, on that self-reflection. Lisa.
Look, I could probably have written this question because I'm very direct with my communication style, and it does get up people's noses. The thing that I found that worked the best for me is connecting with my fellow board members away from the board meeting and really getting to know them and them getting to know me and understand what my motivations are for being on the board and understanding my style of communication. And just because I'm being direct in one context for a purpose, it doesn't mean that I'm rude. It doesn't mean that I don't want to hear what you say. It doesn't mean that I just make it the Lisa show and I just want to keep hearing my own voice. And I found that them having that awareness of that broader part of me in the context of a board member in that board really helped to overcome these issues where they might have in the past gotten put off by my style, let's call it. That's not excusing that maybe I can soften up the edges a little bit. So I found that really just asking questions are a great way to direct a conversation or to bring people in, pointing people out directly, or even things like playing devil's advocate or presenting a counterpoint to something helps to invite in these different ways of thinking.
Nice. Steve.
A couple of things there. One of them is a great tool and technique that I've used for many years, and it works really well, is to actually ask permission to ask a question. I'd like to ask a question here. Can I ask that, please? And as soon as people say yes, then you can say what needs to be said. You can actually ask the question. The other thing that I find really quite useful sometimes, and I've seen boards do this very successfully, when they may not have the skills around the board table, but they actually ask a director to focus on a particular area and ask questions around that as the board discussion goes on. So it could well be, look, Dauniika, for this upcoming board meeting, can you really focus on looking at the risk implications of this and asking questions with us about risk? And then the next board meeting, it might be, Lisa, could you focus on looking at the longer term financial implications and what are some of the strategic things we need to look at there? And then it could be, Simon, can you take the black hat so that no matter what anyone else says, you say, what if that was totally different? What if we got this all wrong? What would that look like? It's a really simple but powerful technique. Simon.
Thank you very much. Sean, when are we going to do another live session? Do you have any more questions you want to go before we go live again?
We have a question from Sanjay.
Cool. Would you like to lead with that now, and then we'll come on to Hannah's question?
Sure, I'll just bring up Sanjay. Oh, he's not on.
That's cool. We'll go this one. I'll leave you to work on that one. In the meantime, we'll come on to you in a second. If that's okay. Oh, no, Sanjay, you're with us.
He's with us.
Can you hear me, guys?
100%. Sanjay.
Yeah, because I couldn't see the unmute button there. Sorry about that. I'm just got appointed on to chair an audit and investment committee, and I'm trying to bring some governance things in there as well. So I've heard all what you guys have been saying in the board pro sessions as well. Now, when I try to make the board members focus on the strategic side of things and change certain agenda items and also the minutes, so that as Steve talks about what are the important things, what needs to be done, what are the things which are only for noting, what implications are going to be on the financial and the strategic and operational side. The outgoing chair of the audit committee said, no, he would like to see more details. And one or two other members also concurred. Now, they are not a professional governance people, but they are professional in their own fields. I'm wondering, how do I influence them to change?
Great. Nice question, Sanjay. Thank you. Who would like to that? Dauniika, would you like to any views around there as to how to rebalance that conversation again?
Yeah. I think just to start with, I think committees are the space to actually go down into a bit more detail. So when you're around the board table, you do want to be high level, and that's why you delegate some of these kind of deep dives to your subcommittees so that those people go and have the focus on looking down into your financials, into your internal audits, to really get a good understanding and be able to answer the questions at a more strategic level around the board table. So I think there is some space for a bit more of a detailed focus at the committee meeting. I think you're on the right track as well in terms of bringing in more governance in the management of the agenda and of the papers. Training is the other option. If you've got people sitting on the committee that don't necessarily understand governance and understand that divide between governance versus operations, then getting external people in to do training for them can be very helpful as well.
Thank you, Dauniika. Let's move on to a topic that should be front of mind for all humans. Lisa, your thoughts. What are the 3 things all boards should be doing to respond to climate change?
First and foremost, you need to see it as a risk to the organisation. See it as a risk to the business, up and down your supply chain, as well as what you do. And it could also fall under your director's duties, especially to ensure the sustained operation of the organisation, what we all call a going concern. So see it as a business risk. Secondly, manage it as a business risk. So assess it. Every organisation is going to have a different level of impact that it will have from various climate change impacts. So implement a strategy that is fit for purpose, that relates to that, and manages the risk. On the flip side of that, I also believe that there's great opportunities here for smart boards, for smart organizations to take and authentically integrate environmentally and socially conscious attitudes and actions into the organization across the business for really positive gains. And that's every business is looking for their ROI, and this should be no different, because your shareholders will scream or your members will scream if you're throwing money after something that they don't agree or believe with as being such a risk as you do. The key word here is to do something authentic and that makes sense to the organization at this point in time.
When I was thinking about this question, Lisa, I thought 2 things as well. Make sure that the board composition has people that can grasp big, macro, huge concepts, because it's almost how to eat an elephant. And if you don't have someone around the table, people around the table that can look at something as large as this and can chunk it down into how we address it, I think you're missing a trick. I agree with you about the risk register side of things here. And from a practical point of view, I bike to almost every board meeting that I can and where I live. And I think it's walking the talk as well. So it's not preaching from the board, but actually if you can look at reducing travel or having those meetings online. So actually the board has a role too in playing its role in addressing emissions. And if you're fortunate enough like me to be able to bike there, set the tone and be known as the board member that turns up on the... Let's go for that question from Andrew, which is, at our most recent board meeting, our directors wanted a detailed review of a particular issue going back 10 years, a decade. What do you think? What do you do with the board members who are continually wanting to look in the rear vision mirror, but not only in the rear vision mirror, into the rear vision mirror a decade or so ago? Steve, we're back to you on that one, since we sent a slide there. Yep.
Yeah, I'd be pretty tough on this. Don't take up the time of the board with this. If they want to have a bit of a review, then they can sit down one of the senior staff and organise what the review is, but don't waste the time of the board on this. If they think it's particularly important, then they come up with the 2 strategic issues that they want to address by having the review done, and then the staff can look at that and say, okay, here are the 2 elements that come out of that. But again, I'd come back to, do not waste the board's time on this. The board is there to create the future, and they're not there to review past decisions on things that have changed since then anyway.
Lisa?
Yeah, take it offline. Go do your independent research, unless it's pertinent, like what Steve said. Further add to that, I think the board chair should have a chat with this person, or maybe if it makes sense to the whole board, to just set some parameters around this kind of behavior so that it doesn't get entrenched and we see this happening meeting after meeting.
Nicely
Simon, can I just make one more suggestion on this one? Because I would love to see some boards doing this. The true cost of a board is not how much you pay your directors, if you pay them, nor is it the travel costs, nor is it the time costs. The true cost of the board is how much time does staff spend servicing the board.
Mm-hmm.
So start to track how much time your seniors are spending servicing the board, multiply that by their wages. That gives you an idea of what it's costing you to actually run a board. So it means that we want to be efficient and effective in what we're doing as a board, and we have the right to ask for these things, but recognise that if it's going to take your CEO and 2 senior executives 5 days to do, that's a cost to the board. Keep a spreadsheet on that. Might be very interesting. Simon.
Really nice. Just going back to that climate question too, that Kate Gunthrop, thanks Kate for putting in a resource there, Chapter 0 board toolkit. So if you're wanting questions around boards, and have a look at the link that she's put in there from Chapter 0 in New Zealand. We've got Andrew's question there. We might just move on. And thank you for your question, Kia ora, thank you. And Dauniika, what tips do you have to manage the transition from one board chair to a new chair?
This is always a tricky one, especially if it's a chair that's been in that position for a while. It's very much down to planning and good communication. So communicating the timeline, understanding about when the outgoing chair is going to step away. I think having as much handover as possible between the outgoing chair and the new chair. And in that handover, including introductions to key stakeholders, a full breakdown of the responsibilities that the chair's doing that the rest of the board might not have visibility. Really good one-on-one time with the CEO and key executives that attend the board meetings. And I think it's really helpful if the outgoing chair can be on call for a few months afterwards as well, just to assist the new board chair with anything that comes up that they didn't anticipate happening, just having that point of reference and support to be able to go back to and have the conversation of, oh, how did you manage this and what would you do in this situation?
Lovely points, Dauniika. And I've always found that a new chair appointment from within the organisation is best, someone who's been on the board already rather than parachuting in as a lateral sort of engagement. It just means that it just de-risks the cultural side of things already known around the board table. So if you can bring them from, I don't think it's helpful for the old chair to be around the table for too long. I think the new chair needs to get their own space. And when you're sitting there, just go back to that question for me, Sean, when you're actually sitting around that table and the old chair's there, even if they're not saying anything, it is a little bit disconcerting for the new chair. I've always liked the establishment of the deputy chair role as a way to being a signalling that when this chair leaves, the deputy chair will take that space. Sometimes there's a deputy chair that's just there in their own right, but it doesn't really help with succession. So try and use the deputy chair for that. And if you've got a select committee, if you've got a subcommittee or something that's like that, chairing audit and risk is obviously a nice way for them to get their style to be understood, for them to practice their wares before they go into the chair role. So there's some other practical ways helping that smooth that transition from chair to chair. Thanks, Sean. Would you like to go to another live question for us? And then we've probably got time for about another 3 questions after that. So stick with us. We will be finishing on the dot at 15 minutes to the hour.
Okay, we have David Cunningham. I'll just put you through now, David. Just come off mute there, and if you'd like to ask your question.
Sure, I've almost forgotten my question. Do you hear me okay?
Yes.
All good. Thanks, David. Shoot.
Yeah. My question was about the board attendance by the senior leadership team or exec team. What's best practice? Is it to have certain members there the whole time or to bring them in and out for relevant topic? My practice is that I've got 3 in the COO and the CFO that join for the whole meeting and the others sort of occasionally, but I'm keen to understand what practice is out there.
Yeah, there's a really interesting one because I do find when there's too many executives around the table and not that many independents, it does lose a little bit of its cachet around independent, and you can get sucked down in the executive side of things. So it would be not uncommon for the CEO to be there for the majority of the time and possibly the CFO. Others tend to rotate into the meetings when their papers are being spoke to. It's great for the senior leadership team as a whole to get exposure to the board. One of the questions that often comes up to me when I'm doing my governance coaching is, how do I get my first board role? And I'm saying any exposure you can get to either writing papers, building relationships with the board, presenting papers, helps to de-risk the ability for when you step on that board to understand that nuance of the board environment. So that would be my take around there, is cycle them through, a couple staying through the majority of the meetings, but not getting an imbalance in executive versus non-executive people around the table. Someone else got one other lead that would like to speak, and then we'll continue on. Thanks, David.
Can I just make a comment on that could be very useful too, is that 2 or 3 times a year, you bring in one of your senior executives or one of the people who's in charge of a major program and ask them to have a conversation with the board for 20 minutes about what do they see as the top 2 strategic issues in their area of responsibility over the next 10 years. And then they're not there to solve it, they're just to raise the level of awareness. And it also means that they get to think a little more strategically, and the board get to see the sort of the thought processes this person's going through, and also helps them think a little bit further out.
Cheers, Steve. Let's see if we can fit in another 2 questions, or we'll rattle through these because we've got another 50 that we could have asked. What do you see as the biggest challenge for community and volunteer boards in this calendar year 2023? Who's going to lead with that one?
I can talk to that.
Dauniika, you are.
Yeah, I think community and volunteer boards is a tricky one because everyone there's obviously a volunteer, and the expertise can be difficult to find that you necessarily need around the board because you can't pick and choose who you're having. And I think the rate of change at the moment that these boards need to keep up with it can be terrifying, especially for small charities and not-for-profits that don't necessarily have the funding that they need to be able to get in good training and expertise. So I think it's just about finding training wherever you can for your board members, especially about things that are occurring in current events, AI and ChatGPT and cyber, and just being aware of what's on the horizon, doing environmental scans and just trying to keep abreast of those things and offering support to the board in whatever way you can. I'm not sure, Lisa, do you have anything that you can add there?
Yeah, I think even before that, the biggest problem they always face, finding the right people, and just get creative. That's all I can recommend. There's lots of articles around how to find board members, especially how to find community and volunteer board members out there. I encourage you to read, think outside the square, as they say, to find the right people.
But we've really enjoyed everyone being on the call today. Okay, when you mentioned about AI, we did have a little bit of a joke when we were putting this session together that maybe one day this would be run by ChatGPT and we wouldn't need to be here. But I think it does make it far more personal and human. And with all the frailties and faults of humanity, to have the team around the table. Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Steve. And thanks, Dauniika, for participating. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions. As I said, we had another 50 questions we could have led with, but we'll save those for another day. And as Sean scrolls through all those questions to prove that I wasn't fibbing when we had lots of questions, let's bring this to a close at 1:15. Over to you, Sean.
Fabulous. So thanks, Simon. That was very well run. Please feel free to connect with the team today. I'm sure they'll look forward to your connection. Their details are on the screen there. If you'd like to be put in touch with Simon, Stephen, Lisa, or Dauniika, you can indicate your interest on the survey, I should say, at the end of the webinar as you exit. We've got some fantastic webinars coming up. The next one on our schedule is the importance of a rigorous annual board work plan. And in the end of April, which I'll be announcing shortly, we've got a fantastic topic on AI, which you'll definitely want to attend and listen to. Now, as you leave the webinar, don't forget to fill out the survey. It'll only take you a minute or so, and go in the draw to win our hamper, which is $400. We'll announce the winner shortly after the webinar today. Thanks, everybody, for your attendance. I hope you enjoyed the Q&A session. Thanks to Simon for leading us, Stephen, Lisa, and Dauniika for the great conversation. We look forward to seeing you back at our next webinar, which, as I mentioned before, is on the 23rd, and it's the importance of a rigorous annual board work plan. And that'll be led by Simon Telfer again, Giselle McLaughlin, and Linda Carroll. So thanks, everyone, for attending today. Have a fantastic day.